So, the title of this morning's discussion is Feeling Lucky. Now, of course, today's title is me just having a little bit of fun with a couple of dates on the calendar. This past Friday was Friday the 13th. Yes. Um, which when it comes to dates, I am not superstitious, but it's funny, the whole 13th thing. Um, I know at one time when buildings were built, if it went above 13 floors, they would actually skip 13, and it would be, you know, the floors would be 11, 12, 14, because as if, just by changing floor 13 to 14, you're fooling no one. Uh, but in any case, superstitions kind of crack me up. I think another one was when building houses at one time, the architects would always make sure there's not 13 steps. I'm pretty sure that was a thing at one time. And so, a lot of superstitions around that. Second reason why I chose the title Feeling Lucky is we have St. Patrick's Day coming up, which we associate with the luck of the Irish. However, if you actually really read history and the history of the Irish, I never quite understood where that came from, but leprechauns and four-leaf clovers, yada yada. And I am well in my rights to make fun of such things, being 3/4 Irish. So I can say what I want about the Irish, and it's okay. Yeah, so I'm actually 3/4 Irish, 1/4 Italian. So what I like to tell people is you got to be very careful around me because I have an Irish temper with an Italian attitude. And of course, coming up with the title, Feeling Lucky, thinking I was so clever. Later, when I was working on the message, I thought, why does that sound so familiar? And then it came to mind an old Clint Eastwood movie, Are You Feeling Lucky? So I will not try to do a Clint Eastwood imitation for you. I excuse me there. I like Clint Eastwood too much to do such a bad imitation of him. But really, cutting to what I would like us to talk about today or explore today is three individuals. First one, a gentleman by the name of Pat. The second one, individual by the name of Elliot. And the third, an individual by the name of Paul. Now, the first one you probably have heard of. I just mentioned we got St. Patrick's Day coming along. And of course, the Apostle Paul, and which we had just read from one of his letters. But the third is Elliot, and I will get into him in a little bit. First, I just want to talk to you a little bit about St. Patrick's. Now, this is not going to necessarily be a St. Patrick's Day message, but I did want to reference a little bit about St. Patrick, and there's a common theme between these three individuals. So, St. Patrick, or as he was known before achieving sainthood, he was known as Patrick. And early in his life, he was born into a wealthy Roman British family. And he had the unfortunate luck of being captured by raiders and forced to work as a shepherd in Ireland and as a slave. And so he found himself going from being a child or a young man in a wealthy Roman family to all of a suddenly being out in the fields of Ireland as a slave, being forced to tend sheep. But an interesting thing happened during that time for him. And that is during that time, he had a lot of time to pray. He found himself in a situation, and at that time, to be a shepherd slave was not a really great life. It was very harsh, but at the same time, despite that harshness of what he was going through, he actually had a deepening of his faith. Then eventually he escaped, and he was able to return home. I'm not going through all the details. There's plenty of resources. It's actually a very interesting story to go and look at. But he escaped and was able to return home to Britain. And he actually, there's even supposedly he had a vision that led him in his escape. But when he returned to home, when he was back with the wealthy family, back home in British, he was free. He was not content. There was something that wasn't right. After his experiences, when he returned home, he was never the same person. He experienced something that changed who he was. And eventually, after being home for 6 years, he was enslaved for 6 years. After being back home, he felt a calling to return to Ireland. He felt a calling to return and minister to those who had enslaved him, where he suffered, where he was a slave, where he had a very poor life and had a life of servitude. He answered the call to return to those very same people, to that very same land. And he was incredibly successful at this. He's credited for really bringing Christianity to Ireland, for building churches. There's legends of him driving out snakes, but that's more representational in terms of what he did in the ministerial work. And Patrick died March 17th, which is now celebrated globally as St. Patrick's Day. And so here we have an individual who had a very lovely life, or at least so it would seem, who, through no fault of his own, ended up being a slave in a foreign land, suffering under poor conditions. And when he finally was free of that situation, he answered the call that God put on him to bring salvation to those who did him wrong. Now, how much of this is historically accurate? How much of it is maybe built up a little bit? I'm not a historian. It's not for me to say, but I cannot help but to find it inspiring. Because I don't know about all of you, sometimes I'm not that good at letting go of grudges, if you know what I mean. But he certainly did that, and God used him in a mighty way. But what I especially find is that it was during his time of captivity, it was his time as a slave, that his faith grew the deepest. When we're going through hard times, sometimes that's when God is doing the most miraculous things. Now, we're going to fast forward quite a bit, and we're going to go on to the next individual I mentioned, gentleman by the name of Elliot Michener. and I am probably butchering his last name. So moving forward, I'm just going to call him Elliot. And those of you who know me, you know that yes, God has blessed me with many gifts, and one of those gifts is I am truly gifted at butchering both the English language and people's names. But this individual, I learned about him when I was visiting my sister out in California this past year. Had the opportunity to go out. My wife and I were able to go out and stay with my sister. And we also got to catch up with Mary's brother-in-law, who ironically we found out was, I'm sorry, my brother-in-law, Mary's brother, um, so Mary's brother ironically lives only about 30 minutes away from where my sister lives out in California. Pretty crazy, especially considering it's a big state. But in any case, while we're out there, we got to do a lot of really cool things, saw a lot of cool stuff, and was ultimately able to check off a box on my list. Now, when I say my list, you may know what I'm talking about. How many people here have a list of things? This is what I want to do before God calls me home. Okay? Also sometimes called a bucket list. And for me, one of those things was I always, for my entire life, ever since I was a little kid, speaking of Clint Eastwood, full circle here, when my father took me to see the movie Escape from Alcatraz. Ever since I saw that as a kid, I have been fascinated by Alcatraz. And this past year, I got to finally visit Alcatraz, and it was a lot of fun. Also, it was really neat. It was very comforting to see the cells that these people stayed in. Made me feel much better about the first apartment I had when I moved out of home. I didn't think it was possible, but there are smaller living spaces. So while there, going on the tour and everything else, I learned about this gentleman by the name of Elliot. Now, Elliot is a very interesting individual. He is. I'm gonna try to make this fast because I still got to get to Paul. So I'm really gonna try to give you the Cliff Note version. But Elliot was a bad guy, a criminal, was involved in a lot of various things that landed him in jail, and he ended up trying to repeatedly escape from different prisons. And through his attempts of escaping various prisons, that landed him eventually in Alcatraz. And while he was in Alcatraz, and this is a guy he was involved in a variety of different crimes during his days of freedom, and and then even when he was incarcerated, he continuously tried to escape. He was not a model prison, and the thing to remember is that with Alcatraz was kind of like where they sent the people. Let's just say it's where they sent the troubled children. Okay, if you know what I mean. So there he is on Alcatraz, out in the middle of this prison island, and he ended up with a interesting job where he was able to hang out outside kind of one of the prison walls, because in the courtyard where the prisoners would be able to get some rec time, they would play handball. And sometimes a ball would go over the wall. Well, his job was to collect any of the balls that went over the wall. And so he's kind of walking along looking for the balls to collect, to hand them in. This is his job. Different people in the prison, they had jobs. And he found something on the ground that was very unexpected, something you typically would not expect to find just laying there on the ground. He found a ring with a whole bunch of keys on them. They were the prison keys that a guard dropped, and he found them. And this is an individual who had a history of constantly trying to escape. And he got these keys, and you know what he did with them? He returned them. He immediately returned them. Going against the pattern of his life, he returned these keys. And because of that returning of the keys and showing that he was trustworthy, he was given a very special job. And that was, he had the opportunity to prove that he could be rehabilitated by becoming a gardener at the prison. See, in Alcatraz, on the outside, and if you go there today, there's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful garden. And that was one of the programs they had. And he had the opportunity to be a gardener, and he took tremendous pride in that garden. And in many ways, his experience of gardening gave him a lasting interest in creativity. It had an incredible presence. In fact, Eliot, later in his life, Eliot wrote, and it was like a hillside. The hillside provided a refuge from disturbances of the prison, the work, a release, and it became an obsession. This one thing I do well. And that time in that garden, tending that garden, changed his life. It changed who he was. Because of good behavior, he was inevitably released from Alcatraz to downgraded to a different prison, and eventually he worked his way back into society, married, and had a very successful life. Because he returned those keys. Now, when I reflect on that, and it's easy to say, yeah, so he made one decision, and that one decision changed everything for him. But me, being who I am, I can't help but to see the hand of God on that. That God, in the midst of that prison, created a singular opportunity that turned this man's life around. In the midst of being what was arguably the worst prison, the toughest prison, Alcatraz. A prison which, I don't know about any of you, I could not list very many prisons. But I know Alcatraz. Infamous. But it was in the midst of that, and he ended up there. Unlike Pat ended up in his circumstances by no fault of his own. Eliot ended up there because of the decisions he made. But in both instances, we see the hand of God, don't we? The third individual I want us to reflect upon, and this is one whom I'm assuming all of us know very well, a gentleman by the name of Paul, one of the apostles. Earlier, we read from Philippians chapter 1, verse 12 through 18. I'm not going to delve into all of 12 through 18. We're going to focus on the first, it's called math, 3 verses of today's reading. So we see Paul in prison. Now, in this instance, Paul is in prison for the best reason. In the case of Pat, he ended up a slave because raiders came in and he was captured. Very unfair. In the case of Elliot, he had made a series of bad decisions, broken the law, and quite frankly, he got what, you reap what you sow. And so we have very unfair, brought it upon yourself, to Paul, who ended up in chains for all the right reasons. Why do I say that? Because he was preaching the gospel. And during that time, and during Paul's imprisonment, his attitude about being imprisoned is so incredibly impressive. Now, I'm not going to ask anyone to raise their hand on this one, but I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask that you really think about this, and in your mind and in your heart, answer this question honestly. Have you ever been angry at God? Now, I will go ahead and raise my hand. I'm sure we can all think of situations where, you know what, we probably said to ourselves, God, this is not fair. Why is this happening to me? Why am I in this situation? I don't deserve this. In the case of Paul, he did what God called him to do, shared the gospel. That's a tough place to be doing the will of God, to do what God has been called you to do, and then to be treated that way. Man, you want to talk about an excuse to be angry, to hold a grudge, and say, I'm doing what God asked me to do, and this is how I'm being treated? It's a very tempting place to go, isn't it? And we see that Paul did not go there. In fact, just the opposite. In verse 12, he says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. You see, he wasn't thinking about, well, what's in it for me? He's looking at the bigger picture. He recognized that this is not about me being comfortable. This is not about me having a good life. This is not about me, which is very difficult for us to understand from a worldly perspective, especially today when everything is me, 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 me. He recognized that he was where God was going to use him the best. And the thing is that when he was there, and you think about this, let me ask you this question. And this one, raise your hand, don't raise your hand, I don't care. But have you ever found yourself in that place where you feel like, what on earth am I doing here? Nothing is being accomplished. I am wasting my time. I don't know if anyone's ever been there before. Well, here's the thing. God doesn't waste our time. He didn't waste Paul's time during his imprisonment by the Romans. And God never wastes our time. We may be someplace where we might feel like we're in a holding pattern. I know I've been there. I've been in situations where I feel like, okay, Lord, I don't know if I should turn left or right. And when I say, Lord, what do I do? Do I do this? Do I do that? And the answer comes, yes. And you feel like, well, and there you may feel like, okay, I'm just kind of here. But God is still doing something. We do not always see it. We do not always recognize it. We do not always understand why we are where we are. And we may feel like nothing is happening. And maybe we're even a little bit bitter about where we are because we may feel like we don't deserve this. On the other hand, maybe you're in a bad place because you made some bad decisions. But just because you're in that place doesn't mean that God isn't working. Verse 13, he goes on and says, as a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. See, Paul recognized that even though, yes, he was in prison, yes, his freedom was taken from him, yes, he was put in this place where, let's be honest, is not a very nice place to be. But yet, God put him in a place where Paul could still minister effectively and bring glory to God, even in the most less than, the worst condition, the less than ideal circumstances. Paul didn't need everything to be easy for his testimonial to be effective. Think about any info commercial ever done. Any info commercial. And I love info commercials. You don't really see them out. You don't see them the way you used to. At least I don't. I don't know. I don't watch as much TV as I did in my younger days. But I loved TV. I love info commercials because I just thought they were the funniest darn thing ever. I love them. The whole thing of if you get this, you'll find that you'll grow 10 inches taller, your teeth will get whiter, and your bank account will grow. The ladies will find you more attractive. You'll get a promotion at work, all because you now use this toothbrush. The most unrealistic claims, and at the same time, and you know the line that's coming, but wait, there's more. It's comical. All of these crazy promises. And they were effective because if info commercials were not effective, we wouldn't have them. So imagine this info commercial. Yes, that's right. You too become a follower of Jesus Christ. You could live in poverty, be persecuted, and end up in jail. Sounds dandy, doesn't it? But yet, the gospel, the truth of the promise that we have through Jesus Christ, does not work on worldly principles. That despite the fact that he was in chains, verse 14, and because of my chains, and most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. We know that Paul wrote Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians all from prison. And here we are today studying his word, these words that he wrote in prison. Some of the most influential letters ever written, more influential than most anything else when pen went to paper, was written in prison. And so, I guess to try to pull everything together and get you all out of here in a relatively timely manner, I'll phrase it this way. This past Friday was Friday the 13th, representation of very bad luck. Later this week, we have St. Patrick's Day, and we're going to see a lot of clovers and things representing good luck. My belief is that we are neither lucky nor unlucky. We find ourselves in different circumstances, sometimes by doing the right thing, sometimes by doing the wrong thing, and sometimes by doing nothing. But it doesn't matter how we end up in those situations. Maybe you were doing the right thing like Paul. Maybe it's because you did the wrong thing like Elliot. Or maybe because you did nothing like Pat. The truth is that luck is not based upon our situation, because it doesn't matter what our situation is. God can do amazing things in us and through us, regardless of our circumstances. And in some instances, even more effectively because of bad situations. So, whatever your situation may be, or where you've been, or what's going on, or what will be going on, because we all know life ain't easy. And if you're not going through a rough patch right now, you've been through one, and you probably got one coming around the corner. God is with you. God can work in you. And God can make you feel pretty darn lucky. Not because of luck, but because despite our situation, despite our circumstances, God can always bless. Amen.